The Night House is a 2021 horror film directed by David Bruckner and written by his two long-term friends and collaborators, Ben Collins and Luke Petrowski. It was actually filmed in 2020, but then, It stars Rebecca Hall as Beth, a recently widowed schoolteacher who starts to have supernatural events occur that seem to relate to her late husband. Eventually, she discovers that he may not have been the perfect man she thought he was, and mysteries grow as she continues to investigate. The basic premise seems like a run-of-the-mill ghost story. Her husband kills himself just outside of her house, and then his apparition appears, apparently the cause of the spooky events that are going on around her. There are a few things that separate it from the run-of-the-mill haunted house, however. The first is the lead performance by Hall. She is driven, affected by grief, but not letting it control her, and she doesn't take shit from anyone. One of the driving themes of the film is the people in her life telling her what to do, and her ignoring them, sure of her own path. The second difference from other films in the genre is fittingly the second act. The first half hour of the film sets the scene, introduces a few mysteries, and has a few good scares. The next act continues the horror elements, but also has this heavy investigation component, as Beth tries to discover exactly what was happening with her late husband, and what his cryptic suicide note meant. The final difference is spoiler territory. The spoiler-free review is that it is well acted, has good scares including a few jumps, and an ambiguous but satisfying story that keeps hairs raised for almost the entirety of the runtime. Some elements are disconnected, and depending on your interpretation of the ending, it may feel hollow, but it's a very entertaining watch regardless. 4 out of 5 stars. Now to spoil the entirety of the film. It turns out this is not in fact the ghost of her husband, but a demon that she brought back with her after she died in an accident many years ago. Called Nothing in the film, it shows up as negative space, but also in the guise of her husband. Early on in the film, it seems like he has been cheating on his wife with a woman who looked like her, which is exactly what he has been doing. But, in addition, he was sacrificing them to appease the demon, at least temporarily. In the end, he found himself unable to satiate the malevolent presence, and killed himself rather than harm Beth. That is the literal interpretation, at least, or one of them. The other is the creature is actually Death himself, similar to Final Destination, trying to rebalance the scales. So another is that all of the supernatural elements are metaphorical, a representation of grief or depression. Both of these play huge parts in the film, so it's not a long reach to believe they are simply personified in the visual elements, a la The Babadook. To really explore this though, it's best to take a look at the film in its entirety. The first shot shows a house clearly built for 2 people, with his and her sinks, and architectural plans. Beth is seen arriving, though the speech is muffled, as the viewer is placed inside the house, looking out. That is a common theme throughout the film, some lines almost requiring subtitles to understand. Beth wears black and is clearly not in a good state. She brings in a large plate of food, maybe a casserole, then tosses it in the garbage. Soon after, she is seen eating from the platter, ashamed of her outburst but not too proud to go without food. All throughout the house are reminders of her dead husband, and through longing shots of recessed pillow and half a dozen photographs around, you see just how happy they were, and how much she misses him. The first night something seems to occur, and we see a shadow of a person, but it's not made clear whether this is an actual apparition or merely visual trickery. Beth then wakes up on the floor, and both the viewer and her are unsure if what happened was real or just a dream. Throughout this sequence, there are multiple shots of her being small compared to the vast house, with empty windows and door frames paid special attention. After she heads off to her day job, we get the first audible lines of dialogue, almost 10 minutes in. She encounters her friend Claire, a fellow teacher, and they have a brief talk hinting about what happened. It's only in the next scene, when she's alone and an obnoxious parent confronts her, that she states bluntly what happened. That's a critical character trait for her. She wants straight talk. She asks the parent exactly what she wants, and the parent is stumped by the question. Beth doesn't have time for hidden agendas or roundabout ways of things. She wants truth, straight and simple. There's another piece of dialogue here that grows in importance later. He shot himself with a gun I didn't even know he had. Not knowing something potentially frightening or harmful has caused this sudden shock to her, and she doesn't let that happen again. Many of the characters who are supposed to be on her side advise her to give up on looking, to stop investigating, and let dead dogs lie. Of course, her refusal to do that drives the movie's plot, and all the well-meaning characters seem to give her the worst advice at any given time. The need to understand is also a natural response to such a traumatic event, and it's clear she wants to know if it was her fault, if there was something that she did, or didn't do, that caused her husband to kill himself. Later that night, she watches the tape she made of him building the house. Interestingly enough, despite her talking directly to him, he never says anything. Although his body does have dialogue later in the film, there is never anything directly from him as a person, in flashback or otherwise. This may mean to imply that she didn't actually know him, and that while she can remember what he looked like, what face he presented, she was never able to know who he was under the mask. Despite her intrigue about why he did it, she's also furious with him. and because of that she grabs everything she could that reminds her of him, and tosses it away. In the process of this, she comes across plans for her house, as well as some notes about a labyrinth, and a reverse house. These don't make any sense at the time, so she dismisses them. Another night of strange dreams, including receiving texts from her dearly departed. When she wakes, however, there are no messages on her phone. She then checks his phone, and in the process discovers a picture of someone that looks exactly like her, but with no ring. She brings this new evidence to her friend, who acts extremely suspicious. This is one of the elements that doesn't quite come together in the end, as there is every hint that her friend knows something, or was involved with him in some way, but nothing appears. She agrees to go out with a night of drinks with fellow teachers, who may be her friends, but are also utter assholes to her, asking utterly inappropriate questions, and then telling her that it's not okay to joke about suicide, less than a week after her husband shot himself. Here we learn that she had struggled with depression and dark thoughts, but he had been above that, and he had helped her deal with them. Here his suicide note is revealed. You are right. There is nothing. Nothing is after you. You are safe now. She initially says that she has no idea what it means, but this is a lie. The only one she tells in the film. The note's meaning changes over time. Initially it seems like nonsense, potentially the ravings of a madman. Then in the next scene we learn that Beth was in a terrible accident when she was a teenager and died for 4 minutes. When she came back she lied that she didn't remember what was after death, what sort of afterlife awaited them, but she did remember. There was nothing. The only person she told this to was her husband, so the note has a meaning known only to her and to him. At this point in the film, it seems like this is a nihilistic take on the afterlife. There is nothing after death. Nothing is after you. You in this case meaning your life. It's only the last line that doesn't make sense, for now. She falls asleep in her friend's lap, and then we have the loudest jump scare in the history of the goddamn world, followed by a creepy dream where she sees girls who look like herself kill themselves, one after the other. Here Beth does some more investigation, and finds a folder full of women that look like her. She then heads out into the woods and finds a house from her dreams, but encounters the neighbor, Mel, who we've seen before. He again tries to tell her what to do, to follow him and give up on whatever she thinks she is looking for. Ignoring that, she searches the woods and finds a strange mark on a tree, leading her to a shell of a house. Exploring the interior, she finds a voodoo doll in a heart-shaped vase. She brings this knowledge back to the neighbor, and he details an encounter he had with her late husband, when he brought a strange woman into the same woods, but made Mel promise not to tell her about the encounter. Owen describes urges that he needed to quell, and how his liaison helped with those desires. Mel didn't delve further, because like everyone else in the movie, he believed it's best to let the past die. He does offer a critical bit of commentary, though, that he left a hole in your life, and you're desperate to fill it. That's what this is. Her investigations into the mystery, the need to understand, are all ways to help her deal with the grief. Some people deal with grief by drinking themselves to death, and some deal with it through community. He mentioned earlier that Beth and Owen were angels to him when his wife passed, so he believes everyone should deal with death in the same way he did. Yet another misguided attempt at helping Beth, a core theme for the story. He also offers the quote that, "You're closer to death than you've ever been," ironic and humorous to both Beth and the audience, given her literal death as a teenager. Her investigations continue, and she discovers a number of occult books in Owen's collection. During this time, we have increasingly voyeuristic camera angles, peeking around a pillar as she investigates a noise. Despite nighttime oogie boogies, she continues her quest for answers, investigating the store the books came from. Here is where she finds both the shelves the image was taken from, and the shop girl. The girl is reluctant initially, but offers that she had met Owen, and nothing had happened. Beth relays this information to her friend, who restates that she should let things lie, and that all she is going to find is hurt. Again, this should have come to something, but doesn't. Claire is also profoundly unhelpful, offering her the worst kind of advice in this situation, being both dismissive and confrontational. At the end she says "I love you," but Beth doesn't return it. Also notable is this is the only time those words are spoken, or written. This is the beginning of the third act, as Beth heads to her lakeside home. She arrives, and prepares for another horrible night, when there's knocking at the door, the same as her first encounter. This time though, it's real, as the bookstore girl has come to tell her the truth. It turns out Owen had taken this woman, and likely many more, back to the house, and then to the mirror house. They had kissed, and then he had choked her, though when she asked him to stop, he did. The girl offers the lovely nugget that he clearly felt guilty about cheating on you, which makes Beth feel much better. After she leaves, Beth decides to investigate the house again, heading out through the rain and wind. She yells out to him in God that, "I'm still here," a line that will be repeated. She then steps through a weak plank, and discovers at least half a dozen corpses, mummified and hidden beneath the floorboards. Terrified, she retreats to her own house, her own domain, and calls Claire. After that, some spooky things occur, and though it is set up like a jump scare, the only thing that appears is a word. Here, an invisible presence confronts her, and despite the hideous revelations she had just discovered, she is overcome with happiness and the ability to physically feel her husband. In exactly the way the bookshop girl described, he rests his chin on her, then feels her back, and finally reaches for her throat. He then whispers to her the wham line, "I'm not Owen." This starts off a haunted house sequence where she sees Owen killing women in a variety of different ways as she is dragged around by a presence, shown only in silhouettes and negative space. At one point she sees Owen, face split in half by a mirror crack, the two-faced man. After this carnival of horrors, we get some exposition. As described earlier, this presence, or nothing, supposedly haunted her as negative thoughts, then passed on to Owen, who tried to contain, trick, and manipulate it to save her. He was always the romantic, murdering doppelgangers of her so that his supernatural force believed it claimed her, at least for a little while. Here we get the final meaning of the note. You are right, there is nothing, a creature of darkness. Nothing was after you, but by killing myself I saved you, and now you are safe. The demon taunts her, contorts her to be the shape of a voodoo doll meant to protect her, and then brings her to the lake, offering her the same gun that Owen took his life with. He is all the negative thoughts that she had ever had, offering her that it doesn't matter, let go, come back to death. In the end she is saved, however, as Claire swims out and is able to shout over the negative thoughts, bringing her back to reality. Our final image is of the boat, drifting on the lake. Mel offers, "There's nothing there," and just visible in the shadows of the lake is nothing. As stated before, there are a number of takes on the film, all of which are correct. There are a few common ones, but here's one that is less so. The entirety of the supernatural events didn't happen. There is nothing impossible, nothing that couldn't have transpired in the real world. The dreams are just that, dreams. And none of the actions Beth took are ones that couldn't be explained by her research. And investigating the other side of the lake is a natural progression when looking for information. Owen, however, believed in the supernatural. Beth died and came back and said there was no afterlife. It's mentioned he disagreed with her on this, and even managed to convince her that she was wrong, at least until he killed himself and left that note. This realization broke something in him, and he was unable to deal with the existential dread of there being no afterlife, just nothing. Due to this, he creates a monster that he can fight, an issue that he can solve, and that is what appears in the film as his monstrous form, the nothing of dreams. He created the house to trap this imagined threat, and even killed those girls to continue the delusion. Beth does the exact same thing when she comes to terms with his death, and just like him, she is unable to deal with the reality of the situation and feeds into that same delusion. There is something, however, that is implied but not shown, and that is the abuse of Beth. In her view, Owen was the perfect husband. Only after his death did she discover a dark side. However, we see the brutality and violence he was capable of, and the sequence near the end, and there's no reason to believe that didn't also happen to Beth. Disassociation is a possible consequence of such horrible events, and could result in an effect similar to memory loss, causing her to have this idealized version of him despite what actually happened. She imagines those events happening to all those other women who look exactly like her, because while she experienced those things herself, she is unable to deal with that reality. The monster that she imagined possessing Owen is just the side of him she didn't want to see. Despite everything, though, she chooses to live in the end. It's not her friend that knocks the gun out of her hand. She chooses to put it down. Just like everything in the film, it's her actions that define her life, and not those that others have acted upon her. She realizes she can't fight nothingness, but can choose to live on. That's just one interpretation, though, and if you agree or disagree, I would love to hear any thoughts on this film, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Have a nice day.